Nobody should be standing in the rain tonight. That was all she said. No questions, no hesitation. Just a woman in grease-stained overalls standing in the doorway of her daddy's garage waving 6 Hells Angels bikers out of a Texas storm like they were old neighbors coming home for supper. 6 months later, those same men would return with hundreds more behind them to save everything she had left in this world. If you believe one act of kindness can change a life, stay with me until the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The rain had been falling since 4 o'clock that afternoon, and it showed no sign of letting up. Emily Carter stood beneath the one working overhead light in her father's garage, her hands black with grease up to the elbows, her hair pulled back in a tight braid that had started neat 12 hours ago and was now half unraveled at the base of her neck. The radio on the workbench was tuned to a country station out of San Antonio, but the signal kept cutting in and out because of the storm, and every few minutes it would dissolve into static, and Emily would reach over without looking and tap it twice on the side until the music came back. She didn't need the music. She just needed the company. That was the part that people in Hatchfield, Texas never quite understood about Emily Carter. She wasn't lonely in the sad way, not in the defeated way, but she had a particular relationship with silence that required her to keep anything going in the background. A radio, a fan, the sound of an engine turning over. Without it, the garage got too quiet. And when the garage got too quiet, she started thinking about her father. And when she started thinking about her father, she stopped working. And if she stopped working long enough, she started remembering that he was never walking back through that door. 3 years since Raymond Carter had died. 3 years since she'd held his rough, oil-cracked hand in the hospital room and listened to him breathe his last breath, slow and stubborn to the very end, the way he did everything. 3 years since she had driven back to this garage alone and sat in his chair and made the decision that she was going to keep it open. For him, for the town, for herself. The truck she was working on belonged to Dale Whitmore, who lived 4 streets over and could barely afford groceries most months, let alone a repair bill. The transmission had been grinding for 6 weeks. Dale had been limping along on borrowed time, and Emily had finally told him to bring it in on a Thursday because Thursday nights were slow and she could give it the time it needed. She wasn't going to charge him. She never charged people who couldn't pay, which was a business philosophy that would have driven any accountant in the county straight to an early grave. But Raymond Carter had never charged people who couldn't pay either, and Emily figured she wasn't going to be the one to break that tradition. She was elbow deep in Dale's transmission when she heard it. She stopped. The sound was low at first, a rumble threading in underneath the rain. Different from thunder, different from the highway traffic that moved along Route 9 a quarter mile east. This was mechanical, rhythmic, deliberate. She straightened up, slowly wiped her hands on the rag hanging from her back pocket, and listened. 6. She counted 6 distinct engines before they cut out one by one in front of the garage. Emily walked to the open bay door and looked out into the dark and the rain. 6 motorcycles. Harley-Davidsons, every one of them, pulled up in a loose line on the gravel apron outside the garage. The riders were still mounted helmets coming off now, shaking the water from their hair. The light from inside the garage reached just far enough to catch the leather vests, the patches, the insignia on their backs. 3 letters. Emily had lived in Texas long enough to know what those 3 letters meant. She felt the instinct that anyone would feel in that moment, that cold animal awareness at the base of the skull that says, step back, close the door, don't invite this in. She'd heard stories. Everyone had heard stories. The Hells Angels had a mythology in America that preceded them into every room they ever entered, a mythology built from decades of headlines and Hollywood movies and late-night news reports. And standing in the open doorway of her garage at 9:30 on a rainy Thursday night, Emily Carter felt every one of those stories pressing in on her at once. She stood there. She didn't step back. She didn't close the door. What she did was look past the patches and the leather and the mythology, and what she saw was 6 men sitting in a Texas rainstorm soaking wet. One of them bent over his handlebars in a way that suggested he wasn't doing it for fun. The one nearest to the door, a broad man with a thick gray-streaked beard and a road atlas of lines across his face, met her eyes. He said nothing. He just looked at her the way people look at you when they're trying to read whether you're going to call the police or not. Emily made her decision in about 4 seconds. Bring the bikes inside, she said. Nobody should be standing in the rain tonight. The big man with the gray beard stared at her for a moment, like he genuinely wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. "You sure about that?" he said. His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that had learned over many years not to give too much away. "I got a working bay and a roof," Emily said. "Get the bikes in here before they drown." There was a pause. Then the man turned to the group behind him and said something short, and the five others exchanged glances that Emily couldn't entirely read, something between disbelief and a kind of careful, restrained relief. They brought the bikes in. 6 Harleys lined up in her father's garage, and Emily stood to the side and watched them come in one by one, the riders guiding them through the bay door with a practiced ease. And when the last one cleared the entrance, she pulled the manual lever and brought the rolling door down behind them. The rain hammered the roof. The radio cut to static. Emily tapped it twice. The music came back. "I'm Emily," she said, and extended her hand toward the man with the gray beard. He looked at her hand for a moment, then he shook it. "Jack," he said. "Jack Reynolds." She looked past him at the others, a younger man with a jaw like a piece of granite, who hadn't taken his eyes off her since she'd spoken, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a massive forearm tattoo of an eagle, a lean and quiet man who was standing slightly apart from the others watching her, with something that might have been curiosity, and 2 more she hadn't fully clocked yet. "Somebody's bike giving you trouble?" she asked. "Danny's," Jack said. He gestured toward the lean, quiet man. "We were about 40 miles out of Hatchfield when she started losing power. Made it this far. She won't make it much further." Emily nodded. "Which one?" Jack pointed to the far Harley on the left, a wide glide with about 90,000 miles on her by the look of the frame. Emily walked over to it without ceremony, crouched down, and started looking. "You a mechanic?" the young man with the granite jaw asked. He said it carefully, not rudely, but with a particular inflection that suggested he had been expecting to deal with someone's husband or father or male employee. Emily didn't look up from the bike. "This is my garage," she said. The young man said nothing else. She heard Jack make a sound behind her that might have been a suppressed laugh. The problem with Danny's bike turned out to be a fuel delivery issue, a clogged petcock and a carburetor that hadn't been properly cleaned in longer than it should have been. Not a catastrophic failure, but the kind of problem that accumulates quietly over thousands of miles until it finally refuses to be ignored. Emily worked. She didn't talk much when she worked, and the 6 men seemed to understand that, or at least to respect it, because they gave her space and moved around the garage with a kind of quiet care, not touching anything that wasn't theirs, not in her way. The man with the eagle tattoo, who she later learned was called Ruiz, found 2 folding chairs against the wall and set them up without being asked. The young man with the granite jaw turned out to be named Cole, and he watched Emily work with a focus that eventually shifted from wariness into what she recognized as genuine interest, the look of someone who knew engines and was paying attention to someone who knew them too. "You learned this from your dad?" Cole asked about 40 minutes in. "Mostly," Emily said. She was calibrating the float level on the carburetor, her fingers working by feel as much as sight. "Took some courses, worked a summer in San Marcos at a shop there. But yeah, mostly from my dad. He died," Emily said. "Well, 3 years ago. This was his shop. 30 years, she said. He built it from nothing. 2 lifts and a set of hand tools he bought at an auction." Cole was quiet for a moment. "And you kept it going?" "Trying to," Emily said. "It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't heroic. It was just the truth delivered flat and honest, and something about that honesty seemed to land differently than speeches do." Jack came over after a while, coffee mug in hand. He'd found the coffee maker on the back bench and figured correctly that the offer was implicit in the open door and the warm garage, and watched Emily work. "She's going to need a new carburetor eventually," Emily said without looking up. "What I'm doing tonight will hold, but she's going to need a rebuild." "How long tonight's fix last?" 6 months if he keeps it clean, a year if he's careful." Jack nodded slowly. "What do we owe you?" Emily sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Nothing." Jack Reynolds was the president of one of the oldest Hells Angels chapters in the southern United States. He had navigated disagreements that would have terrified most people in law enforcement, let alone civilians. He was not a man who was easily caught off guard. But he looked at Emily Carter right then like she'd just said something in a language he wasn't fluent in. "Nothing," he repeated. "You were caught in the rain," she said simply. "I wasn't going to leave you in it. We could have found a motel." "You could have," she agreed, "but you didn't need a motel. You needed a mechanic. She stood up and wiped her hands. That's what I am. What? The rain got heavier around 10:30, the kind of rain that turns Texas roads into rivers, and Emily called over to Dale Whitmore to let him know his truck was going to need one more night. Dale was fine with that. He'd half expected it, and when she hung up, Ruiz was standing at her workbench, looking at a framed photograph. Is this you? He asked. Emily came over. The photograph was one she'd put up years ago and barely saw any more herself at about 9 years old, standing next to her father in front of the garage, both of them grinning, Emily holding a wrench that was nearly as big as she was. Yeah, she said. You've been in this garage your whole life, Ruiz said. It wasn't a question. Pretty much, she said. Some people have roots in the ground. Mine are in the concrete. Ruiz looked at the photo for another moment. My father had a shop, he said. Bodywork in El Paso. He set the photo down carefully. I left when I was 17. Never went back. He didn't elaborate and Emily didn't ask him to. There was a particular kind of silence that existed between people who understood about fathers and leaving and the weight of what you choose to carry forward, and they stood in it together for a moment, without needing to fill it. I'm sorry, Emily said quietly. Yeah, said Ruiz. Me too, Chomaine. Somewhere around midnight, the lean and quiet man Danny, the one whose bike had failed, sat down on an overturned milk crate near Emily's workbench and watched her clean her tools. Why did you let us in? He asked. Emily considered that for a moment. Because you needed in, she said. Most people see us come in, they lock up and go inside, Danny said. He didn't say it with bitterness, just the flat matter-of-factness of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by it. You looked at us and opened the door wider. You were wet and you had a broken bike, Emily said. I've been breaking down on the side of the road since I was 16. Somebody always stopped. She hung a wrench on its hook on the pegboard. That's just what people do. Not always, Danny said. No, Emily agreed, not always, but enough times that I figure I owe it back. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, who stopped for you when you broke down? Emily smiled a little, the first real smile that had crossed her face all evening. Old man outside of Laredo, I was 19. Driving my dad's flatbed back from picking up a used engine block, and the radiator blew 60 miles from home. This old man in a battered pickup pulled over. 70 years old if he was a day. He had water in the truck, and he helped me rig a temporary fix, and he followed me for 40 miles to make sure I made it. You know who he was? No, Emily said. I never got his name. He was gone before I could properly thank him. She paused. That's always bothered me a little. And so now you pay it forward, Danny said. And so now I pay it forward, she agreed. Danny looked at her for a long moment, the way people look at you when they're seeing past the surface of you to something underneath. That old man would be glad to know, he said finally. Emily didn't say anything. She just went back to cleaning her tools. But her hands had gone still for just a moment, and something had moved behind her eyes. And Danny, being a perceptive man who had spent 20 years learning to read people for survival, had noticed. He didn't mention it. Some things don't need to be mentioned. Around 2 in the morning, Emily brought out a cast iron skillet and made eggs. It was the most natural thing in the world to her. If you had people in your space past midnight, you fed them, and the 6 men who had settled into her garage over the course of the evening arranged themselves around the workbench and ate scrambled eggs with hot sauce from the bottle she kept on the shelf next to the motor oil. And for a while, the conversation moved the way late-night conversation does, loose and unhurried, ranging from bike routes to weather systems to a particularly bad stretch of highway in New Mexico that 3 of them had ridden in conditions worse than tonight. Cole ate 2 plates and looked like he could have managed a third. Ruiz made the eggs himself for the second round, having watched Emily do it once, and decided he had improvements to offer. The eggs were in fact better. Jack sat at the end of the bench and watched all of it with the quiet attention of a man who was cataloging something. How long you been running this place alone? He asked Emily during a lull. 3 years, she said, no staff. Bobby Nguyen 2 days a week, but he's in school, so it's more like 1.5. She shrugged. Mostly it's me. You get enough business? Enough, she said. Some months are tighter than others. A pause. This month is one of the tighter ones. Jack nodded slowly. I imagine, he said, that doing free work doesn't help the math. Emily looked at him. No, she said, but some math isn't the right kind of math. Another silence. Then Cole laughed a short surprise sound like he hadn't expected it to come out of him, and Ruiz smiled. And the man with the forearm eagle, whose name turned out to be Marcus, shook his head slowly in a way that was closer to admiration than disbelief. Jack Reynolds just kept watching Emily Carter. She didn't notice. She was already back up checking the work she'd done on Danny's carburetor, double-checking her float level. Because that was the thing about Emily Carter. She didn't think about what she'd done once it was done. She just kept moving forward, kept looking at the next thing that needed to be fixed. At 3:15 in the morning, the rain began to let up. The radio had been playing steadily for the last hour, and the current song was something old, something Emily's father had loved, and she was standing with her back to the group, putting her tools in order, and she was singing along under her breath without realizing she was doing it just the way her father used to do. Danny noticed. He elbowed Cole very gently and nodded in Emily's direction. Cole listened for a moment. Neither of them said anything. By 3:30, the storm had moved east, and the Texas sky was doing what the Texas sky does after a big storm. It was clearing fast, turning from solid black to a deep bruised purple at the edges, stars beginning to appear. Jack stood up and stretched the sound of his spine, making a catalog of complaints about 6 months on the road and a night on a folding chair. "We should let you sleep," he said to Emily. "I wasn't planning on sleeping much," she said. She turned around. "Danny's bike will hold. Keep her clean. Don't push her past 4,000 RPM until you get that carburetor rebuilt properly and you've got a good 800 miles in her easy." Danny nodded. "I'll take her into a shop next week." "I can recommend one," Emily said. She wrote a name and a number on the back of one of her own business cards and handed it to him. "Guy named Sal in Amarillo. Tell him Emily Carter sent you. He won't charge you an arm and a leg." Danny took the card. The group began moving their bikes toward the bay door. Emily raised it, and the cool, washed, clean air of post-storm Texas came rolling in, carrying the smell of wet earth and cedar and something electric and fresh that always followed the rain in this part of the country. They filed out one by one, bikes, loaded engines, starting up in the early morning dark. Jack Reynolds was last. He stopped in the doorway and turned back to Emily. "Why are you helping us when you don't even know us?" he said. Emily didn't have to think about it. "Because someone helped me once," she said. "That's how kindness works." Jack looked at her for a long moment. His face did something complicated, not quite emotion, not quite the suppression of emotion, but somewhere in between, in that territory that people occupy when something has reached them that they didn't expect to be reached by. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a card. He held it out to her. It was a simple card, just a name and number and a small embossed insignia. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you call that number, day or night, doesn't matter." Emily took the card. She looked at it. She looked back up at him. "Thank you, Jack," she said. He nodded once, got on his bike, pulled out of the gravel apron onto the road. Emily stood in the open bay door and watched the 6 Harleys disappear south on Route 9, their taillights diminishing in the clearing dark until the sound of the engines faded to nothing, and the only thing she could hear was the dripping of water from the edge of the garage roof and the distant sound of the radio still playing the old song her father had loved. She looked down at the card in her hand. She didn't know, standing there in the doorway of her father's garage at 3:40 in the morning, grease on her hands and a cold cup of coffee on the bench behind her, that she had just made 6 of the most unlikely allies she would ever have in her life. She didn't know that in a few months' time, she would need them more desperately than she'd ever needed anything. She just tucked the card into the front pocket of her overalls, went back inside, turned off the overhead light, and went back to work on Dale Whitmore's truck. Because that was what she did. She fixed things. It was the only thing she'd ever truly known how to do. What happened next would test that in ways she wasn't ready for. But she didn't know that yet. She just worked alone in the garage, the radio playing softly in the dark. The post-storm sky outside beginning slowly to lighten. And on the workbench in the front pocket of her overalls, a business card sat waiting for the moment when everything would change. The card sat in the front pocket of her overalls for 11 days before Emily forgot it was there and sent those overalls through the wash. She found it afterwards soft and a little blurred at the edges, the ink still readable, but the card itself carrying that particular fragile quality of something that had been through something it wasn't meant to go through. She set it on the corner of her father's old desk under the edge of the lamp and told herself she'd transfer the number to her phone later. She didn't. Not because she forgot exactly, but because the kind of woman Emily Carter was didn't easily accept the idea that she would ever need to use a number like that. She had managed this garage and this life through 3 years of hard months and tight margins and small emergencies that she had solved herself with her own hands the way her father taught her. You didn't call in favors. You fixed what was in front of you. You kept moving. That was the Carter one, and Emily carried it like a faith. 11 days was about how long her peace lasted. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when the first man showed up. Emily was under a Silverado doing a brake job when she heard the bell above the front door ring, which was unusual because people who came to Carter's garage for mechanical work generally came to the bay, not the office. She slid out from under the truck and saw a man in a tan blazer standing in the doorway between the office and the shop floor, holding a clipboard and looking around the garage with the flat, assessing expression of someone doing an inventory. "Can I help you?" Emily said. The man turned. He was in his mid-40s, bland-featured, with the particular brand of affable neutrality that certain types of professionals developed as a professional tool. "Emily Carter? That's me. Gerald Marsh, Travis County Tax Administration." He held up his clipboard. "We received a flag on your property account. I need to go over some figures with you." Emily wiped her hands and came into the office. She was not a woman who was easily rattled by bureaucracy. She paid her taxes. She kept her records. Raymond Carter had drilled that into her from the time she was 14 years old, sitting at this same desk going through the same ledgers. You could be late on a lot of things in this life, he told her, but you could never be late with the government. Gerald Marsh sat down across from her and opened his clipboard, and then he said a number. Emily stared at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "Can you say that again?" He repeated the number. It was larger than her mortgage had ever been. It was larger, in fact, than the garage had earned in its last 2 full operating years combined. "That's not possible," Emily said. Her voice was very steady. She was working to keep it that way. "I have every return I've filed for the last 12 years right here in this office." "The discrepancy isn't in your returns," Marsh said. He turned the clipboard around so she could see it. "It's in the property valuation record. There was a reassessment conducted on this parcel in August. The assessed value was revised significantly upward." "In August," Emily said. "I didn't receive any notification of a reassessment. Notifications were mailed. I didn't receive them." Gerald Marsh looked at her with that same professionally neutral expression. "I understand that's frustrating, Ms. Carter. However, the assessment stands as filed. You have 60 days to file a formal appeal." He left a stack of papers on the desk and saw himself out. Emily sat at her father's desk for a long time after he left, staring at the number on the top sheet. She did the math in her head. She did it again. She did it a third time, hoping the answer would change. It didn't. She picked up the phone and called her accountant, a woman named June Kowalski, who had handled Carter's garage finances for 15 years and who Emily trusted more than almost anyone else in Hatchfield. June listened to the number in silence. Then she said, "Emily, that's not a clerical error." "I know it's not," Emily said. "Someone requested that reassessment." "I know that too." A pause. "Do you have any idea who?" June asked. Emily hadn't let herself say the name out loud yet, but she'd been thinking it since Gerald Marsh walked through her door. She'd been thinking about a certified letter she'd received 6 weeks ago from a company called Voss Development Group, LLC, which had offered her an amount of money for the Carter's garage property that seemed at the time surprisingly generous. She'd sent it back unopened with a handwritten note on the envelope. "Not for sale." "Yeah," Emily said quietly. "I think I have an idea." She heard June exhale slowly on the other end of the line. "Emily, if this is what I think it is, this isn't a fight you take to the tax office." "I know," Emily said. "You're going to need a lawyer." "I know that too. A good one, not a local one." Emily looked around her father's garage, at the pegboard where his tools still hung in the order he'd put them, at the photograph of the two of them near the door, at the faded Carter's garage sign above the oil rack that Raymond had hand-lettered himself in 1987 and touched up 3 times since. "June," she said, "have you ever heard of Voss Development?" The pause that followed was just a half-second too long. "Everyone in Central Texas has heard of Voss Development," June said carefully. "Michael Voss built the Lakeside Commons project in 2019, the Ridgemont Industrial Park in 2021. He's been on the business pages of the Austin paper every other week for the last 4 years. And, and June said, I've heard things from other clients, from people at the county office. Another pause. Emily, there were two other property owners on your block who received offers from Voss in the last 18 months. Both of them initially declined. She stopped. And then what? Emily said. And then both of them sold, June said, within 90 days. The line was quiet. June, Emily said, what happened to them? I don't know exactly, June said. I know one of them had a health code issue show up out of nowhere. The other one, a dry cleaner, been in business 20 years, had a tax problem, very similar to what you're describing. A breath. Both of them were gone inside of 3 months. Emily put the phone down on the desk and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked it back up. I'm not selling, she said. Emily, I'm not selling, June. Find me a lawyer. The lawyer June found was a woman named Patricia Okafor, out of Austin, who had a reputation for taking cases that involved what she described in their first meeting as institutional pressure on small landowners. Patricia was direct and quick and did not soften things, which Emily appreciated. Here's what I'm looking at, Patricia said. They were sitting in Emily's office, the tax documents spread between them. The reassessment is irregular. The timeline is irregular. The magnitude of the upward revision, 340% in a single cycle, is extraordinary and almost certainly challengeable. She tapped the papers. However, Emily waited. However, the appeal process takes time. 6 to 9 months minimum before any meaningful relief. And in the meantime, the back taxes accrue interest. Patricia looked at her directly. Can you service that debt while we fight it? Emily was quiet. She ran the numbers the way she ran all numbers, clean and honest, and without the comfort of rounding up. The answer was no. Not comfortably. Not without significant sacrifice. Maybe not at all, depending on how the next few months went. I'll find a way, Emily said. Patricia looked at her for a moment. I believe you will, she said. Then she closed her folder. But I want you to know what you're walking into. Michael Voss has lawyers I'm familiar with. He has relationships at the county level that I'm also familiar with. What he doesn't have is a defensible position if we get this in front of a judge, because the math doesn't lie. But getting to a judge takes time, and time is what he's counting on. He wants me to run out of runway, Emily said. That's exactly right, Patricia said. He wants you exhausted and broke before we ever see a courtroom. Emily nodded once. Then we'd better get started. The next thing happened 2 weeks later. Emily was opening the garage on a Monday morning when a truck from the county building inspection office pulled up. 2 inspectors got out, and they were polite, professional, and thorough in the way that people are polite, professional, and thorough when they have been sent somewhere with a predetermined conclusion in mind. They cited 11 violations. 3 of them were real, a ventilation issue in the back bay that Emily knew about and had been planning to address, a floor drain seal that was aging, an electrical panel that needed a new certification. She had known about those things. Every working garage had a list like that, a maintenance queue that you work through at the pace your budget allowed. The other 8 violations were things Emily had never seen before. A clearance measurement in the front bay that had apparently been recorded incorrectly. A storage protocol issue in the parts room. A fire suppression specification that, as far as Emily could determine, applied to facilities 3 times her square footage. The inspectors left her with a notice. She had 30 days to address all 11 items before a follow-up inspection. If the follow-up found continued violations, the county had the authority to issue a temporary operating suspension. Emily read the notice standing in her bay. She read it again. She called Bobby Nguyen, her part-time helper, and told him what had happened. Bobby was 22 and studying automotive technology at the community college and had been working for Emily for 2 years. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her. Ms. Carter, one of my professors, his brother owns an auto parts warehouse out on Highway 6. He got a visit from county inspectors last spring. Same kind of thing, multiple violations, very fast, hard deadline. Emily went still. What happened to him? He fixed what he could, Bobby said. Couldn't fix it all in time. Got suspended for 3 weeks. A pause. He sold the building in May. Emily hung up the phone and stood in the garage and let herself feel it for a minute. The full weight of what was happening, the shape of it, how deliberate and how patient and how entirely engineered it was. the reassessment, the inspectors. It was a sequence, not a coincidence. It was someone methodically taking apart the supports under her life one at a time, waiting for the whole structure to come down. She thought about calling Patricia. She did call Patricia. Patricia said, "I was expecting this. Document everything. Photograph every item on that citation list today before anything changes. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the County Oversight Board this week." "Will that stop them?" Emily asked. Patricia was quiet for a beat. "It will slow them down," she said. "But Emily, I have to be honest with you. They have more levers than we have handles. We're going to fight this, and I believe we can win it. But it's not going to be fast, and it's not going to be easy." Emily thanked her and hung up. She photographed everything in the garage that afternoon methodically. Every corner, every measurement, every item on the citation list. She borrowed a neighbor's ladder to document the roof clearances. She drove to the hardware store and bought the parts she needed for the ventilation fix and the drain seal. She worked until midnight getting the 3 legitimate violations corrected because those at least were hers to handle, and Emily Carter handled what was hers. She did not sleep well. The customers started disappearing in week 3. It was subtle at first. A regular who'd been bringing his fleet of work trucks to Carter's garage for 4 years called to cancel an appointment. He was apologetic. Vague said he'd found someone closer. Emily thanked him and let it go. People change mechanics. It happened. Then Mrs. Abernathy, who had brought her Buick to Raymond Carter and then to Emily Carter for going on 18 years, called and said she wouldn't be coming back. She sounded uncomfortable. She sounded like someone who had been told something. Then a local contractor who had 6 vehicles on Emily's standing maintenance schedule called and said he was making other arrangements. Emily tracked the pattern for 2 days before she called Dale Whitmore, whose truck she'd fixed in the rain on the night the Hells Angels came, and who had no reason to lie to her. "Dale," she said, "I need you to tell me something straight." "I'll try," Dale said. "Are people in this town saying something about my garage about me?" The silence on Dale's end was long enough to tell her everything. "Dale." "Emily," he said, and his voice had gone low and unhappy. "There's a man who's been making the rounds, talking to business owners, to regulars of yours. I don't know who he is. He's been saying there are serious safety concerns about your garage, that the county inspection found major problems, that it might not be safe to bring vehicles in." A pause. "He's been saying it to a lot of people." Emily pressed her hand flat against the top of her father's desk. "Thank you, Dale," she said carefully. "Emily, I'm sorry. I would have called sooner, but I only heard it myself yesterday and I wasn't sure." "It's okay," she said. "Thank you for telling me." She hung up and sat with it. A manufactured tax crisis, a coordinated inspection sweep, and now a rumor campaign, someone going door to door through her community and quietly dismantling her reputation, one conversation at a time. It was efficient. It was patient. It was exactly the kind of pressure that worked on people who didn't have resources to withstand it. And Michael Voss had clearly done this before because he understood the precise sequence of it, the way each piece built pressure on the last. She picked up the phone and called Patricia. "He's running a disinformation campaign in the community," she said. "Someone's going around telling people my garage is unsafe." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Emily had not heard her say before. "Emily, I need to talk to you about something." The way she said it made Emily's stomach drop. "What?" "I did some additional research on Voss development this week," Patricia said. "I found 4 other properties in Travis and Williamson counties where the same sequence played out. Tax reassessment, inspection violation, community pressure." A breath. "In all 4 cases, the property owner eventually sold. In 2 of those cases, the owner told me afterward, this is off the record. They won't testify that they were specifically told by a representative of Voss Development that if they continued to resist, things would become significantly more difficult." "That's extortion," Emily said. "That is extortion," Patricia agreed. "But saying it and proving it are 2 different things. The people who told me wouldn't go on record. They're afraid." Emily let that settle. "Are you afraid?" she asked Patricia. A pause. Then with something in her voice that might have been a kind of legal professional's version of admiration, "No, but I am clear-eyed about what we're dealing with." Another pause. "Emily, I'm going to keep fighting this case with everything I have. I want you to know that. But I also want you to be prepared. This man does not stop. He has never had to stop before. Emily looked at the card on the corner of her desk, the one she'd pulled out of the laundry, the one with the name and the number. Maybe, she said quietly, he just hasn't met the right kind of resistance yet. She didn't explain what she meant. Patricia didn't ask. The property documents went missing on a Thursday. Emily had kept all the original land ownership documents in a fireproof lockbox in the back office. The deed, the survey maps the original title, the chain of ownership going back to the parcel purchase her father had made in 1986. She opened the lockbox to pull the survey map for Patricia, and she stood there looking at the inside of an empty box. She checked the desk. She checked the filing cabinet. She went through every drawer in the office twice, then a third time, not because she thought she'd find them on a third pass, but because the human mind resists accepting certain facts until it has exhausted every alternative. The documents were gone. She had not moved them. She had not given anyone access to this office who could have taken them. The lockbox showed no sign of forced entry, which was in some ways worse. She called Patricia, and Patricia said very quietly, "Were there copies filed with the county?" "Of course," Emily said. But county records are administered by the same office that administered your tax reassessment," Patricia finished. "Yes, I know." A long silence. "Emily, this is escalating." "I know it is. Are you all right?" Emily looked around her father's office, at the desk he'd sat at for 30 years, at the photograph near the door, at the receipt book he'd kept the last year of his life, his handwriting in the column headers precise and careful. Raymond Carter had built something real here, something that had cost him 30 years of early mornings and late nights and calloused hands and a bad back. He never complained about, and someone was methodically trying to erase it. "No," Emily said. "I'm not all right." Then she straightened her spine. "But I'm not selling," she said. The thing about being under sustained pressure is that it does something to your perception of time. The weeks that followed felt to Emily simultaneously like they lasted forever, and like they moved with terrifying speed each day, bringing something new to deal with some new piece of the machinery that was working against her, revealing itself, and no sooner had she addressed one thing than the next thing appeared. Her insurance carrier sent a letter raising her premium by 60% due to elevated risk assessment. She called the carrier and was told a complaint had been filed with their underwriting department, citing the county inspection violations. She spent 2 hours on hold trying to reach someone with authority to address it and was transferred 4 times and eventually told someone would follow up within 10 business days. 2 of her remaining regular customers told her in the same week that they'd received personal phone calls from a number that came up as a local business association, warning them that Carter's garage was under investigation by the county and that they might want to consider alternatives while the situation was resolved. Emily drove to the local business association office and stood in front of the director, a man named Howard Fitch, and asked him directly whether his organization had made those calls. Howard Fitch was a small man with a small manner who shifted in his chair when Emily looked at him directly. "The association sometimes provides community updates on business compliance matters," he said. "Did someone pay you to make those calls?" Emily asked. Howard Fitch's eyes went to the desk and stayed there. "I don't know what you're implying, Ms. Carter." "Yes, you do," Emily said. "She left without touching anything because she was Raymond Carter's daughter, and Raymond Carter's daughter did not make scenes." But her hands were shaking by the time she got back to her truck, and she sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She was losing. She could feel it the way you feel the ground shifting under your feet before you consciously register that you're moving. She was losing customers and money and time, and every institutional door she tried to open was either locked or had been turned to face the wrong direction, and Michael Voss hadn't even had to appear in person yet. He was doing all of this from a distance through intermediaries, through the administrative machinery that he'd apparently spent years and considerable money learning to operate. Patricia called her that evening. "I got your property records from the county," she said. "There's something wrong with them." Emily waited. "The survey record has been amended," Patricia said. "There's a notation added to the file 6 weeks ago, right around the same time as your reassessment, that raises a question about the eastern boundary of your parcel. It's a small thing on paper, about 8 feet of your property line. That boundary has been the same for 38 years, Emily said. I know, Patricia said. And the original survey says so, but the original survey is what's missing from your lockbox. A pause. Emily, with those documents gone and the county record amended, someone is in a position to challenge your eastern boundary, which would affect your access easement, which would technically make it significantly harder for you to operate the garage legally. Emily sat down. They're going to claim I don't own the driveway. They're going to claim it's ambiguous, Patricia said, which in legal terms can be just as effective. The line was quiet for a moment. Patricia, Emily said, be honest with me. What are our chances? Patricia took a breath. Without the original survey documents, our case got harder. I have subpoenas out for several county communications. I'm pursuing the amended record through administrative channels. But Emily, this is going to take longer than I thought, and it's going to cost more than I originally estimated. More than I originally estimated. Emily heard what that meant. She heard what was underneath it. How much more? She asked. Patricia told her. Emily was quiet for a long time. I'll figure it out, she said. She hung up and sat in the dark in her father's office and did the math, the kind of math she hadn't let herself do before, because as long as she didn't do it, the number was theoretical. Now she did it straight through, no rounding, no optimistic assumptions. She had 4 months. Maybe 5 if she cut everything she could cut. After that, the accumulated tax penalties and legal fees and the plummeting income from the customer loss would put her underwater past the point of return. 4 months. She looked at the card on the corner of the desk. She picked it up. She looked at it for a long time, then she put it back down. Not yet. She wasn't there yet. She still had 4 months and she was a Carter, and the Carters figured things out. She went back to work. The call from Dale Whitmore came on a Wednesday night at 11:40. Emily picked up on the second ring because she was still awake, sitting at her father's desk going through invoices and trying to find places where the math could be made to behave differently than it had been behaving. Emily, Dale's voice was wrong. She heard it immediately. Dale, what's going on? Emily, I need you to listen to Bob. His voice was low, urgent in a way that made her straighten in her chair. I just drove past your garage about 20 minutes ago. Okay, Emily said carefully. There was a car parked down the block. Dark sedan, no plates I could read, just sitting there. Emily felt something cold move down her spine. You sure? I've gone past that garage 3-4 times a week for 9 years, Dale said. I know what belongs there and what doesn't. A pause. I drove around the block and came back and it was still there. I sat and watched for 10 minutes. Nobody got out. Nobody drove past. Just sitting. Emily was very still. I don't want to scare you, Dale said, but I thought you should know. After she hung up, Emily locked every door in the garage that had a lock. She called Patricia's emergency line and left a message. She thought about calling the police, and then she thought about the building inspection team and the tax office and Howard Fitch and the business association calls, and she thought about how far Michael Voss's connections apparently extended into the institutions of this county, and she decided the police could wait. She sat in her father's garage, and she did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. The message was 2 words, smart woman. She stared at it for a long moment. Her hands were very steady. Her heart was going at a different pace than it usually went. She took a screenshot. She sent it to Patricia. Then she put the phone down. She reached across the desk. She picked up Jack Reynolds' card. She turned it over in her fingers. She thought about what Jack had said when he left. Day or night, doesn't matter. She thought about what Patricia had said. He has never had to stop before. She thought about her father sitting at this same desk in 1986, signing papers on a piece of land that nobody wanted and building something from nothing with his hands and his stubbornness and his belief that honest work meant something. She thought about the business cards soft around the edges. From the wash, the ink slightly blurred. She set it back down on the desk. She wasn't ready to make that call. Not yet. But the cards stayed right where she could see it. And 3 weeks later, when she drove back to the garage at 6 in the morning during a night away and found the building already on fire, the card was the first thing she thought of. The fire moved fast the way fires do when they have help. By the time the trucks arrived, half the roof was gone. By the time the sun came up, Carter's garage was 4 walls and a floor full of ash. Emily stood across the street and watched it burn. She was not crying, not because she wasn't feeling it, but because whatever was moving through her in that moment was too large for tears, too large for most of the usual human responses to grief. It was the kind of loss that doesn't make noise. It just opens something up inside you and sits there. A firefighter came over and asked if she was all right. She looked at him. "That was my father's garage," she said. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? She stood there until the fire was out and the smoke was just wisps rising into the morning air. And then she walked across the street and stood in the doorway of what used to be the building she'd grown up in and looked at the ruins of 38 years of her family's life. Her phone was in her hand. She didn't think about it this time. She found the contact and she pressed call. Jack Reynolds picked up on the second ring. His voice in the first syllable told her he'd been awake. "Emily," he said. She said, "They burned it down, Jack. They burned down my father's garage." And Jack Reynolds, a man who had spent 30 years cultivating a voice that revealed nothing, said something that told her everything she needed to know about what happened next. He said, "We're coming." Jack said 2 words and hung up. Emily stood in the ash of her father's garage with the phone against her ear, listening to the silence after the call ended, and she held it there a moment longer than necessary, the way you hold on to something when you're not quite ready to let go of the last solid thing you touched. "We're coming." She didn't know what that meant exactly. She didn't know how far away Jack was or how many people we referred to or what coming was going to look like in practical terms. She knew only that she had made the call she'd been avoiding for 3 months and that the 2 words she'd received in return had done something to the cold that had been sitting in the center of her chest since she'd seen the smoke from 2 blocks away. It didn't fix anything. The garage was still 4 walls of blackened concrete and a floor full of ash and water from the fire hoses. Patricia Okafor still had a case that had gotten harder every week for 3 months. Michael Voss still had not appeared in person, still had not put his name to a single thing, directly still existed for Emily as a force rather than a face. But 2 words from Jack Reynolds had shifted something. She put the phone in her pocket and walked back across the street. A small cluster of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, people who'd seen the smoke or heard the trucks in the night. Dale Whitmore was there standing with his hat in his hands, his face carrying the particular grief of a person watching someone else's loss and feeling the weight of having failed to prevent it. He'd called her about the car. He'd tried. "Emily," he said when she walked up. "I know," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder. She let him. Mrs. Abernathy was there too, the woman who'd stopped coming after the phone calls from the business association. She was standing at the edge of the group looking at the ruined building with an expression Emily had never seen on her before, something that was half shame and half fury. "Emily," Mrs. Abernathy's voice was smaller than Emily had ever heard it. I was foolish to listen to what they said. I should have known." "It's all right," Emily said. "It isn't," Mrs. Abernathy said. "It really isn't." Emily looked at the woman for a moment. 71 years old, had trusted Raymond Carter with her car for 18 years, had trusted Emily for 3 more, had been reached by a phone call from an anonymous number, and had let it plant enough doubt to make her walk away. "Mrs. Abernathy," Emily said, "what exactly did they say to you on that phone call?" The older woman blinked. "They said there was an investigation, that the garage had code violations, that it might not be safe." She stopped. "They made it sound very official. Did they give a name, a department?" "They said County Building Safety." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes sharpened slightly. "Is that, Emily, was none of it real?" "The violations they cited were exaggerated at best and fabricated at worst," Emily said. "And I had addressed the real ones within the week." She paused. "Someone was running a campaign to make my customers leave." Mrs. Abernathy stared at her. "Who would do that?" Emily looked at the burned-out garage. "Someone who wanted this land badly enough to burn down what was on it," she said. The silence that followed that sentence spread through the small group on the sidewalk like a stone dropped in still water, and Emily watched it move across their faces the moment when neighbors who had been watching a fire became witnesses to something uglier and more deliberate. Dale Whitmore's jaw had gone hard. "Emily, do you know who it is?" "I have a very good idea," she said, "and my lawyer is working on proving it." She looked around at the faces watching her. If any of you receive those phone calls, the ones about safety violations, I need you to tell Patricia Okafor. Write down what you remember. The number, the language they used, anything. She looked at Mrs. Abernathy. Will you do that? Absolutely, Mrs. Abernathy said, and the shame in her voice had largely given way to something firmer. Emily spent that morning in the parking lot of a diner 2 blocks from the ruined garage because she needed to be near it and she had nowhere else to be. Bobby Nguyen showed up at 8, having heard about the fire through the town's text chain that seemed to carry bad news faster than any news service, and he sat across from Emily in the booth and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated concern of a young man who didn't have enough life experience yet to know he should soften things. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to find out exactly what we have left and build from it, Emily said. Do you have savings insurance? The insurance carrier raised my premiums last month, Emily said. I switched carriers 2 weeks ago. The new policy hadn't cleared the 30-day waiting period when the fire happened. Bobby went very still. Emily, he said. I know, she said. So you have no... I have the land, she said. I have Patricia working the legal case. I have more than I had yesterday morning in some ways because now there's a burned building and an arson investigation, and that is a great deal harder to explain away than a tax dispute. Bobby was quiet for a moment, processing that. You called them, didn't you? He said. The guys from that night, the bikers. Emily looked at him. You told me about them, Bobby said. The Hells Angels. The guys you fixed the bikes for in the storm. You said one of them left you a card. Yes, Emily said, and you called them. I called him, she said. Jack Reynolds, this morning. Bobby leaned forward. What did he say? He said they were coming. Bobby sat back in the booth and was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Emily didn't expect. Good, he said, simply directly without qualification. Good. She looked at him. Ms. Carter, Bobby said, and he had the manner of a 22-year-old who was choosing his words with the care of someone twice his age. You have been fighting this thing alone for 3 months. You have been reasonable, and you have been patient, and you have filed the right paperwork and followed the right channels, and they have still burned your building down. He met her eyes. Sometimes the right channels are the ones that have been locked against you from the beginning. Sometimes you need people who don't use those channels. Emily studied him for a long moment. When did you get so smart? She said. I've been watching you, he said. I've been watching what they've been doing to you, and I've been angry about it for a long time. Emily reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his. Thank you, Bobby. What do you need me to do? She thought about it. I need you to make a list, she said. Every customer we've lost in the last 3 months. Everyone who told you specifically why they left. Names, dates, anything they said about who called them or what was said. Can you do that? Today, Bobby said. And Bobby. She looked at him seriously. Don't talk about what I told you, about the call I made, not to anyone. He nodded. Understood. Patricia Okafor called at 10:15. I heard about the fire, she said. Are you all right? Physically, yes, Emily said. My building is gone. I know. A pause. Emily, the arson investigation changes things. If they can establish cause in a fire marshal's preliminary report this fast on a structure that burned this efficiently is going to raise questions, then we have a much stronger foundation for the larger case. How long does an arson investigation take? Weeks, sometimes months. Patricia's voice was careful, precise. Emily, I need to tell you something that I found out this morning. I've been subpoenaing county communications related to your case. I got a return last night late after hours, which tells me someone was working hard to expedite it. She paused. The amended survey record on your property, the one that altered your eastern boundary, it was requested and filed by a land use consultant named Devin Marsh. Emily went still. Marsh, she said. Gerald Marsh, Patricia said. The tax administration representative who came to see you in October. His brother. The cold thing in Emily's chest moved. They sent his brother, Emily said. The tax official and the land consultant are brothers, Patricia confirmed, which means the initial assessment visit was not a routine call. Gerald Marsh came to your garage knowing what his brother had already filed. He came to give you papers and see how you reacted. Emily put her free hand flat on the table. They were reading me from day one. That's what it looks like, Patricia said. And Emily, I know this is hard to hear, but this level of coordination means Voss has been planning this acquisition for a long time. Your property isn't a target of opportunity. This is a campaign that was built specifically around you. Why me? Emily said. Why not start with someone else? Someone without the history here, someone without the resources to fight. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I think, she said carefully, that he started with you because he thought you would be the easiest. A woman running a small garage alone, recent death in the family thin margins. On paper, you look like someone who will fold in 90 days. A pause. I think he underestimated you considerably. Emily breathed. Patricia, she said, the people who sold before the dry cleaner the others. Can you get me their contact information? I can try why. Because if they were scared before, they might be less scared now that there's an arson investigation open, Emily said. And if they'll talk, even one of them, we have a pattern that any judge can see. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then Emily, that's exactly what I was going to suggest. I know you were, Emily said, but I want to be the one who calls them. Not a lawyer, me. Another pause. All right, Patricia said. I'll get you the names. All right. It was late afternoon when Emily felt it. She had been on the phone most of the day, moving through the list of things that had to be done, keeping herself in motion because motion was the only reliable substitute for hope she'd ever found. She had spoken to the arson investigator, a quiet, methodical woman named Agent Torres, who asked questions in a way that suggested she had already formed a preliminary view. She had spoken to two of the former customers Mrs. Abernathy had connected her with, both of whom had received the same anonymous business association call. She had spoken to June Kowalski about the accounting and the insurance timeline and the question of what the land itself was worth as collateral. And then she sat down on a section of low concrete wall near the edge of her property and let herself stop for a moment, and that was when it hit her. The full weight of it, 3 months of sustained, methodical attack. The reassessment and the inspectors and the rumors and the documents and the 2-word text message from an unknown number, and now the ash where her father's building used to be. All of it landing at once now that she'd stopped moving long enough to let it. Her father had built that garage with his hands. He had spent 30 years in that building. She had spent her entire childhood in that building. She had held his hand in a hospital room and come back to that building and made herself a promise in the silence of it, and now someone who had never met Raymond Carter, who cared nothing for what his hands had made, had sent a person in the dark to pour something flammable and light a match, and 38 years was ash by 6 in the morning. She did not cry, but she put her face in her hands and she stayed there for a while in the dark behind her palms, and she let the grief be what it was for just a few minutes before she put it back where it needed to go. She heard footsteps. She lifted her head. Dale Whitmore was standing a few feet away with 2 coffees from the diner, holding them out the way men hold things when they don't know what else to offer. She took one. He sat down next to her. They didn't talk for a while. The sound of the town moving around them, the ordinary afternoon sounds of a Tuesday in Hatchfield, was strange against the silence between them. You're going to rebuild, Dale said eventually. It wasn't a question. Yes, Emily said. You need money. Yes. I have some, Dale said. Not much, but I have some. Emily looked at him. Dale, I'm not asking, he said. I'm telling you, you fixed my truck in a rainstorm, and you didn't charge me, and I know for a fact that was because you knew I couldn't pay. And that's Emily. That's not the kind of thing a person forgets. He looked down at his coffee. I got $800 in a savings account that I've been keeping for emergencies. This looks like an emergency to me. She wanted to tell him no. The Carter reflex was strong. You didn't take from people who couldn't afford to give. But she looked at Dale Whitmore's face and understood that what he was offering wasn't charity. It was something else. It was a man who had watched helplessly for 3 months, finally finding a way to do the one thing he could do. Thank you, Dale, she said quietly. He nodded. You got more people like me, he said. You just need to let them help. She thought about that. Then her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Then she remembered the text message from the unknown number 2 nights ago, and she answered with her guard up, her voice level and careful. Mr. Carter. The voice was male, older, slightly rough at the edges. Who is this? My name is Frank DeLuca. You don't know me. I owned a print shop on Commerce Street until about 18 months ago. A pause. Patricia Okafor gave me your number. She said you might want to talk. Emily straightened. Mr. DeLuca? Yes, I very much want to talk. I heard about your garage, Frank said. I saw it on the local news this morning. The fire. His voice had gone somewhere careful. Ms. Carter, I sold my building because I was afraid. I had a wife in chemotherapy and 2 employees I couldn't afford to lose. And when the pressure started, I didn't have the fight in me that I should have had. A long pause. I've been thinking about you all day. Mr. DeLuca, Emily said slowly, did a representative of Voss Development explicitly threaten you? In direct language, silence. Then, a man came to see me. He didn't give me his name. He sat in my shop and he told me that my business compliance file was going to become very interesting to county authorities in the next few weeks unless I was willing to have a conversation about my property. Frank's voice had flattened the way voices flatten when people report things they've suppressed for a long time. He said those exact words, very interesting. And you didn't report it. Who was I going to report it to, Frank said. The county? The same county that had already flagged my file before this man even sat down in my shop. A bitter exhale. No, I sold. I took care of my wife. I told myself I didn't have a choice. Mr. DeLuca, Emily said, would you be willing to say that to Patricia Okafor? In a formal statement. A very long silence. My wife finished treatment 6 months ago, Frank said. She's doing well. Another pause. Yeah, I'll say it. I should have said it 18 months ago, and I'm sorry I didn't. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Thank you, Frank, she said. After she hung up, she sat with Dale's coffee going cold in her hand, and she felt something shift. Not large, not a breakthrough, but a small, definite movement. Frank DeLuca was one person, one statement. But the thing about a chain was that it only needed one real link, and Patricia could build the rest. Jack Reynolds called at 7:15 that evening. Emily was sitting in her truck near the property because she wasn't ready to go home. Yet home being a small rental house 3 streets over, that felt emptier than usual tonight. Tell me what's happening, Jack said. No preamble, no how are you, just straight to it in the manner of a man who thought that small talk in a crisis was a form of disrespect. Emily told him everything. She started with Gerald Marsh in the tax bill and moved through the inspectors and the rumor campaign and the document disappearance and Frank DeLuca and Patricia's discovery about the Marsh brothers and ended with the fire and the arson investigation. Jack listened without interrupting. She could hear him breathing on the line steady and even, and occasionally she heard other sounds behind him. Voices, the low rumble of engines idling, and she understood that he was not alone wherever he was. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Jack said, "How long before your lawyer has enough to move on?" She thinks the arson investigation combined with Frank DeLuca's statement could be enough for a civil case within 60 days. Criminal that depends on the fire marshal and the county DA. Criminal requires the DA, Jack said, and Voss has relationships in the county. Patricia thinks so too. Then we don't wait for the DA, Jack said. Emily, are you listening to me? Yes. There are 2 fights here. There's the legal fight, and that's Patricia's. You keep feeding her everything you have, every witness, every document, every piece. His voice shifted slightly. And then there's the other fight, the one about what Voss knows and doesn't know, about what's visible and what isn't, about what happens when the people he's been pressuring stop being afraid. He paused. That one is mine. Emily held the phone very still. Jack, I need you to tell me what that means. It means I have resources, he said, and relationships, and information networks that operate completely outside the systems Voss has been buying his way through. A pause. We've been looking into Michael Voss since 2 hours after you called me this morning. Emily blinked. You've been investigating him. I have people, Jack said simply. People who are very good at finding things. Emily Michael Voss has done this 10 times. Not 4 times like Patricia found. 10. 3 counties in Texas, 2 in Oklahoma, 1 in New Mexico. His voice had gone flat and precise. 6 of those properties involved the same land use consultant. 3 of them had fires. The air went out of Emily's chest. 3 fires. All ruled accidental or inconclusive, Jack said. Because by the time the investigation opened, The original owners had already sold and moved on, and there was nobody left to push back. A pause to Mom. You didn't sell, Emily. That's the difference. You are still there, and you are the only person in 10 cases who is still standing on their property and fighting. Emily stared through the windshield at the dark outline of her property against the evening sky. Jack, she said, the information your people found, can Patricia use it? Some of it through proper channels, yes. I've already had my lawyer reach out to her tonight. His voice carried something careful. We know how to move things from where we find them to where they can be used officially. It takes a step, but it can be done. And the rest of it, Emily said, the rest, Jack said, is going to be used differently. She didn't ask him to explain that. She thought she understood it, and she thought she trusted him, and she also thought there were things it was better for both of them that she didn't know the specific shape of. Jack, she said, why are you doing this? You owe me a carburetor cleaning and some eggs. This is considerably more than that. The line was quiet for a moment. When Jack spoke, his voice had lost some of its operational precision and become something more human. You know how many garages I've walked into over 30 years, he said. Hundreds, all over this country. And you know what happens in almost every single one when we pull up? He didn't wait for her answer. Either the guy inside reaches for a phone to call the cops, or he tells us we're not welcome, or he just finds somewhere to be that's not near us. A pause. We have gotten used to it. You get used to a lot of things when you've been written off long enough. Another pause longer. And then one night in a Texas rainstorm, a woman we'd never met looked at 6 strangers in leather jackets and said nobody should be standing in the rain. Just like that. No calculation, no performance. Just come in. Emily was quiet. Danny told me afterward, Jack said, that it was the first time in years he'd felt like a regular person. Just a man whose bike had broken down, being helped by someone who didn't see anything else when she looked at him. A pause. You can't put a price on that, Emily. There isn't one. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. When are you coming? She finally said. We're already on the road, Jack said. I am. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her truck near the property until past midnight, and then she drove home and sat at her kitchen table and thought about 10 cases and 3 fires and a man named Michael Voss who had never once had to face the consequences of what he built his success on because the people he chose to destroy were always by design people who were alone. That was the engine of it, she understood now. The selection. He chose people who were isolated. A woman running a garage by herself. A man with a sick wife. A dry cleaner who'd been there 20 years but had nobody behind them. He chose them because their aloneness was the first weapon he used against them, and every step of his campaign was designed to make that aloneness more complete. Cut the customer, cut the income, cut the community ties until the person standing in the wreckage was standing there entirely alone, and the path of least resistance was the only path left. It was in its way a brilliant and entirely evil system. What it had not accounted for was the night a rainstorm sent 6 Hells Angels to a garage in Hatchfield, Texas. What it had not accounted for was the woman in that garage who hadn't asked who they were before she waved them inside. What it had not accounted for was the fact that Emily Carter was not, as it turned out, as alone as she appeared. She thought about Frank DeLuca, about Dale Whitmore's $800, about Mrs. Abernathy's face when she realized she'd been manipulated, about Bobby Nguyen making his list with quiet fury at the diner table, about Patricia Okafor, who had said, I am clear-eyed, and had meant it, about Jack Reynolds somewhere on a Texas highway right now moving toward Hatchfield with a voice that said, we're coming, like it was the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. She thought about her father. Raymond Carter had told her once when she was about 13, in dealing with the particular social brutality of middle school, that the most important thing a person could know about themselves was what they were made of when things got hard. Anyone can be decent when it's easy, he'd said. The interesting question is what you do when it costs you something. She'd thought about that a lot over the years. She thought it was wisdom about character, about integrity, about the choices you made when nobody was watching. She was only now understanding that it was also wisdom about community, about what happened when enough people knew what they were made of, about what became possible when the right people found each other. She fell asleep at the table around 3 a.m, her phone in her hand, her father's photograph on the wall across the room. She was still asleep when at 5:47 in the morning, the sound reached her. She came awake fast the way you come awake When something is wrong, sitting up straight from a dead sleep heart, already going hand on the phone before she was fully conscious. Then she heard it properly. Not wrong, something entirely different from wrong. Engines. She was out of her chair before she finished processing it, through the kitchen and out the front door in bare feet, standing on the porch of her rental house in the early morning light. The sound was coming from the south, from the direction of Route 9. She heard it the way you hear weather coming first, as something felt more than heard. A vibration in the ground and the air, and then louder and louder until it was unmistakable. Until it was not one engine or six engines, but something much larger than that, something she had no immediate frame of reference for because she had never heard a sound exactly like it before. She walked to the edge of the porch. The first bike appeared at the end of her street, then another behind it, then 10, then more. She stood on her porch in bare feet and watched them come. 100 Harley Davidsons, then more behind them, then more. The street filled up. The sound filled the whole morning wall to wall, rattling the windows in their frames, rolling through the early quiet neighborhood like the approach of something unstoppable. They came down her street and they turned onto the road that led to her property, and they kept coming and they kept coming, and Emily Carter stood on her porch and pressed one hand over her mouth and watched them come. Jack Reynolds was at the front. He pulled to a stop in front of her property and dismounted, and behind him the bikes kept arriving, pulling up in rows, engine after engine, shutting down one by one until the silence came back in pieces, and the silence after that much sound was the loudest thing Emily had ever heard. Jack walked toward her. Behind him, hundreds of men and women stood next to hundreds of motorcycles, still and waiting, the morning light catching the chrome and the leather. Jack stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her for a moment, at the bare feet, the kitchen table hair, the hand still half covering her mouth. "You fixed 6 bikes for strangers in a rainstorm," he said. His voice was quiet now, not the operational precision of the phone calls, but something older and simpler. "Today," he said, "a few hundred strangers came to help you fix what someone broke." Emily looked at him. She looked at the road behind him, at the 100+ bikes and the people standing beside them, men and women from across Texas and from other states. People who had gotten a call or a message or a text and had gotten on their bikes and ridden through the night because someone had asked them to, and they had said yes without needing the full story, because the full story had been enough. Her hand came down from her mouth. She was not going to cry in front of Jack Reynolds. She was not going to cry. She breathed in once slowly. "Jack," she said. Her voice was steady, barely but steady. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he said. "You opened a door once. We're just walking through it." He glanced back at the assembled crowd on the road, and when he turned back to her, there was something in his face that she recognized because she'd seen it before the night in the garage when she told him, "Someone helped me once," and that's how kindness works. It was the look of a man who had been reminded of something he'd almost stopped believing in. "So," he said, "tell me where you want to start." Emily put on her boots. That was the first thing she did. She went back inside, sat on the edge of the kitchen chair she'd fallen asleep in 3 hours ago, laced up her work boots with the same deliberate attention she gave to everything that required doing correctly, and then she stood up and walked back outside to where Jack Reynolds was waiting. "I need coffee before I can think straight," she said. Jack almost smiled. "We brought some." She hadn't noticed his truck until now. A battered F250 that had pulled up behind the last row of bikes, its bed loaded with 2 massive thermoses and a collection of paper cups that someone had had the foresight to pack. The man managing it was Ruiz, who handed Emily a cup with the businesslike efficiency of someone who understood that operations ran on caffeine, and who looked at her over the rim of his own cup with an expression that said everything about how he felt about what had been done to her building without him having to say a word. "Ruiz," Emily said. "Emily," he said. That was the full extent of it, and it was enough. She stood with her coffee and looked at the road in front of her property. There were people she didn't know standing in organized rows, and what struck her, what kept striking her in waves, was how quiet they were. She had expected noise. The mythology of the Hells Angels was noise, was thunder and power, and the performative volume of people who had spent decades announcing themselves. What she got instead was stillness. Hundreds of people standing in the early morning light, waiting, and the only sound was the occasional low exchange of 2 people talking close together, and the distant sound of Hatchfield waking up around them. "How many people are here?" she asked Jack. 212, he said. "More coming." She absorbed that. From where? Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Louisiana. A group out of Arkansas left at midnight. He sipped his coffee. Danny put out the call. He knows people in most of those chapters. He told them the story of what happened and what was being done to you, and then he said who was involved, and then he stopped talking because he didn't need to say anything else. "Why?" Emily said. "Why did the story matter that much?" Jack looked at her for a moment. "Because a lot of the people on that road right now have had their own version of what happened to you," he said. "Maybe not from a land developer, maybe from a landlord, maybe from a bank, maybe from a system that decided they weren't worth considering." His voice was even, but there was weight under it. When Danny described what Voss was doing to you, the manufactured violations, the pressure campaign, the burning it down, when you still wouldn't quit, people recognized it. They recognized the shape of it. He paused. "And they recognized you, the woman who didn't ask who we were before she helped us." Emily was quiet for a moment. "So now what?" she said. "Now, boss," Jack said, "we get to work." The first hour was organized chaos that resolved itself into something remarkable. Jack had clearly done logistical preparation that Emily hadn't been aware of, because within 40 minutes of her lacing up her boots, the property was divided into working zones, and the right people were in each one. A crew of 8, who turned out to be licensed contractors from a chapter in San Antonio, were already measuring the foundation and reviewing what the burned structure had left behind. 2 electricians from a chapter in Houston were consulting with a third man Emily hadn't met yet, a building inspector, a legitimate one, not a county plant who Jack had apparently called 2 days ago and who had driven through the night from Dallas. "Wait," Emily said, watching this unfold. "You called a building inspector before I even knew you were coming." "I called one when I heard about your fire," Jack said. 4 hours after you called me." She stared at him. "You were planning this before we even talked about what it would look like." "I was solving the problem," Jack said simply. "You told me what had happened. I started thinking about what was needed. The inspection was going to be an obstacle regardless of when we moved, so I removed it early." Emily opened her mouth and then closed it again. She had spent 3 months navigating a system that moved at the pace of bureaucratic deliberateness. And here was a man who had heard her crisis at 6 in the morning, and by 10 in the morning had a licensed building inspector in a car headed for Hatchfield. She filed that away. There was a lesson in it about the difference between working through a system and working around it, and she wasn't sure yet what she thought about that lesson, but she was clear about one thing: the system had burned down her building. Whatever Jack was doing, he hadn't burned anything down. "What else did you set up?" she asked. "Materials," he said. "I have 2 suppliers who owe me favors. The lumber and steel for a basic structure are arriving this afternoon. The specialty parts for the lifts and the bay equipment, those are coming day after tomorrow from a distributor in Fort Worth." He paused. "I called your insurance carrier." Emily went very still. "My insurance carrier?" "The one who raised your premium," Jack said. "The one whose decision caused you to switch carriers right before the fire." He looked at her steadily. "I had my lawyer contact their legal department at 7 this morning with a letter outlining the timeline and suggesting that a carrier who raised premiums on a fraudulent complaint filed by a third party with undisclosed interest in the property might have some liability exposure of their own." He paused. "They're reviewing your coverage reinstatement as of this morning." Emily put down her coffee cup because her hand had gone slightly unsteady and she didn't want him to see it. "Jack," she said, "Emily, I need to understand something." She looked at him directly. "Are you doing things that could cause problems for my legal case for Patricia?" He shook his head. "Everything I've described is either legal or legally adjacent. My lawyer is in contact with Patricia. They talked last night for 90 minutes. He paused. "We are not doing anything that will compromise your case. What we are doing is applying pressure to the institutions that have been applying it to you through channels they understand at a speed they're not used to defending against." She studied him. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Not exactly like this," he said. "But yes, there have been situations where someone in our community was being pushed around by a system that had decided they didn't matter. And sometimes the most useful thing a group of people with a particular reputation can do is make very clear through entirely legal means that they have noticed. He met her eyes. People who use institutional power against individuals count on those individuals being alone. It changes the calculation when they're not. Emily looked out of the road at 200 people who had ridden through the night. It changes the calculation, she said quietly. Considerably, Jack said. Bobby Nguyen arrived at 8:30, took one look at the organized operation covering his employer's property, and stood for 30 seconds with his mouth slightly open before turning to Emily. "This is Ms. Carter." "I know," she said. "There are 200. I know Bobby." "How did—" "It's a long story," she said, "and I'll tell you all of it someday. Right now, I need you to go talk to the contractors from San Antonio. They need someone who knows the layout of the old building from the inside out, and that's you." Bobby closed his mouth. He straightened up. He nodded once with the air of a young man who had just been given an assignment he took seriously. "On it," he said, and walked over to the contractor crew with the purpose of someone who had somewhere to be. Emily watched him go. Cole appeared at her elbow. He'd been somewhere in the working crowd since the beginning, and his presence startled her slightly because he moved quietly for a large man. "The foundation is solid," he said. "The fire didn't touch it. The 4 exterior walls are standing with damage but repairable. The roof is a total loss, but structurally we're working with more than most people would have after a fire like this." "You know construction," Emily said. "I spent 8 years framing houses before I went on the road," Cole said. He looked at the property with the practiced eye she recognized from the way he'd watched her work on Danny's carburetor that first night. "The basic structure we can have up in 3 days if the materials come through when Jack says. After that, it's systems electrical ventilation, the lift installation. That's 10 days, maybe 12. 2 weeks, Emily said. 14 days from today, you can do a soft open, Cole said. Full operation within 30. She let herself feel that for a moment. 3 months of Voss's machinery grinding her down and 2 weeks to stand back up. "Cole," she said, "thank you." He shrugged with the particular understated discomfort of someone who wasn't used to being thanked. "You want to come look at the foundation with me?" "Absolutely," she said. Patricia Okafor arrived at 10:15, which was fast given that she was driving from Austin, and Emily understood that she had probably left very early. Patricia stepped out of her car, looked at the organized activity covering the property, and then looked at Emily with an expression that was part professional assessment and part something more personal. "Jack Reynolds' lawyer called me at 9 last night," she said. "I know," Emily said. "Jack told me. His name is Marcus Webb. He's out of Houston." Patricia paused. Emily Marcus Webb is a very serious attorney. He has won cases against 3 Fortune 500 companies in the last 8 years. Emily waited. "He sent me a file last night," Patricia said. "The investigation his clients had conducted into Voss Development." She stopped. "Emily, it's 10 cases, the same pattern 10 times. 3 fires. 2 of the former owners are willing to give statements. One of them has a recording." Emily's head came up. "A recording? A voice recording of a conversation with a Voss representative explicitly stating that the property owner had a choice between selling or facing significant regulatory difficulties." Patricia said, her voice very controlled. "The former owner was a retired schoolteacher in Waco who'd had a habit of recording her phone calls since a bad experience with a contractor 10 years ago." A pause. "She's been sitting on that recording for 14 months because she didn't know what to do with it, and she thought nobody would care." "Who reached her?" Emily said. "Jack's people. Marcus Webb's investigator found her last week," Patricia said. "She called Marcus's office this morning and said yes." Emily stood with that for a moment. A retired school teacher in Waco with a recording that could end Michael Voss's ability to do this to another person had been sitting alone with it for 14 months, too frightened and too isolated to know that it mattered. "What does the recording get us?" Emily asked. Combined with Frank DeLuca's statement, Bobby's customer documentation, the Marsh Brothers' relationship, and the timeline of the amended survey and the arson investigation, it gets us a civil case I can win, Patricia said. It also gets us to the DA with enough that he would have to be actively in Voss's pocket to decline to prosecute. She paused. "And Emily, I've been looking into the DA's relationship with Voss. I don't think he's in his pocket. I think Voss was careful to keep his distance from the county DA because he knew he needed that office neutral. So we go to the DA, Emily said. We go to the DA, Patricia confirmed. This week, with everything we have. Emily looked at her. Patricia, when you took this case 3 months ago, did you know it could get to this point? Patricia was quiet for a moment. I believed it could, she said carefully. I didn't know it would. Cases like this usually run out of resources before they reach critical mass. She looked around the property. I had not accounted for this particular variable. Jack Reynolds, Emily said. The network he activated, Patricia said. The speed of it, the coordination. She paused. Emily, in 20 years of practice, I have seen a lot of David and Goliath fights. I have seen some Davids win and a lot of Davids lose. What I have not seen before is David show up with 200 friends, a licensed building inspector, and a recording from a school teacher in Waco. She met Emily's eyes. Today feels different. Emily felt it too. She had felt it since the engines woke her from her table at 5:47, and it hadn't left her yet, that particular quality of something shifting. She was still in the same fight. Nothing was resolved yet. Michael Voss had not been charged with anything. The garage was still ash, and her financial situation was still precarious. None of the concrete realities had changed, but the shape of the thing had changed. For 3 months, she'd been fighting from inside a closing circle. She could feel it closing week by week, the resources diminishing and the options narrowing and the walls of the situation getting tighter. And then she'd made one phone call and the circle had opened. That was what 200 people on a road did. They opened the circle. The call from Agent Torres, the arson investigator, came at 11:40. Emily stepped away from the property to take it, walking to a quieter spot where she could hear. Ms. Carter, Torres said, I have a preliminary finding from the fire marshal's office I wanted to share with you before it goes into the formal record. Emily's grip on the phone tightened. Go ahead. The fire originated in 2 locations simultaneously. Torres said, her voice precise and measured. Southeast corner of the main bay and the northwest corner of the back office. Simultaneous origin points at opposite ends of a structure are not consistent with accidental ignition. It was arson, Emily said. The fire marshal's determination is that the cause was incendiary, Torres said. That's the formal language. What it means is yes. Do you have any evidence of who did it? A pause. I'm not going to discuss active investigative leads with you at this stage, Torres said. What I can tell you is that we are taking this seriously and that we have more to work with than I expected this early. Another pause. Ms. Carter, you mentioned to me yesterday that you received a text message from an unknown number 2 days before the fire. 2 words. Smart woman, Emily said. I need that screenshot, Torres said, and I need your phone records for the 48 hours preceding the fire. You'll have them within the hour, Emily said. After she hung up, she stood for a moment in the quiet away from the property. 2 simultaneous origin points. Someone had come to her father's building in the dark with materials and a plan and had set 2 fires at once to make sure there was no question that it would burn. It was not someone who lost their temper and made a rash decision. It was deliberate and prepared and cold, and it had been done to a building that Raymond Carter had built with his hands in 1986, and the person who ordered it had not lost a single night of sleep over it. Not yet. She walked back to the property. The moment that stopped Emily completely came at just past noon. She had been moving all morning, answering questions, reviewing contractor plans with Bobby, spending 20 minutes on the phone with June Kowalski going over the insurance reinstatement situation, walking through the property with Cole and the lead contractor from San Antonio, a compact and efficient man named Tomas, who spoke in short sentences about structural realities and did not appear to have time for uncertainty of any kind. She had been moving so continuously that she hadn't stopped to see the full picture until she came around the side of the property and looked out at the road. There were more people than there had been at dawn. She counted without meaning to. The bikes lined up along the road, the people clustered in the working zones, the additional arrivals who'd been trickling in through the morning. And it wasn't just the people who'd ridden through the night. There were people from Hatchfield. She recognized Mrs. Abernathy, who had shown up with 3 other women from her church group and had been quietly and efficiently keeping the coffee operation running for the last 2 hours. Dale Whitmore was in conversation with 2 of the San Antonio contractors, apparently explaining something about the original garage layout that he'd observed over years of bringing his truck in. Howard Fitch, the business association director, who'd looked at his desk when Emily had confronted him, was standing at the edge of the property with the expression of a man who was trying to determine whether he should be here and what it would cost him either way. Emily walked over to Howard Fitch. He looked up when she approached, and the calculation on his face resolved itself into something that was not exactly courage, but was at least the next thing adjacent to it. "Ms. Carter," he said. "Howard," she said. He looked at his shoes for a moment, then he looked at her. "I need to tell you something." "Okay." "The calls that went out to your customers," he said, "from the business association number." He stopped, breathed. "I didn't make them, but I knew about them. A man came to see me 6 weeks ago. He said he represented interested parties looking at the Route 9 corridor. He asked if the association could provide community outreach about businesses with compliance concerns." He stopped again. "He paid for that outreach." Emily looked at him steadily. "What was his name?" "He gave me a card. Devin Marsh, Land Use Consulting." The same name, Gerald's brother, the same family threading through every piece of this. "Howard," Emily said very carefully, "I need you to write that down. Everything you just told me, including the name, what he asked you to do, what he paid. I need it in writing by end of day." Howard Fitch swallowed. "If you do that," Emily said, "Todd, you are part of the solution instead of the problem. And in my experience, people remember which side you were on." She paused. "If you don't, then when the rest of this comes out, and it is coming out, Howard, all of it, your silence is going to look like a choice you made." He was quiet for a moment. "By end of day," he said finally. "Thank you," Emily said, and meant it, and moved on. The twist that changed everything came at 2:15 in the afternoon. Marcus Webjack's attorney in Houston called Patricia Okafor while Patricia was sitting with Emily reviewing the morning's developments. Patricia put it on speaker without asking because she read something in his voice when he said her name. "I need both of you to hear this," Marcus said. Emily leaned forward. "My investigator has been running down the corporate structure of Voss Development Group," Marcus said. "Specifically the beneficial ownership, the actual people behind the LLC layers." A pause. "Voss Development is owned 60% by Michael Voss directly. The remaining 40% is held by a holding company incorporated in Delaware called Ridgemont Capital Partners." Patricia frowned. "And Ridgemont Capital Partners," Marcus said, "has 3 beneficial owners. One of them is a real estate attorney based in Dallas. One of them is a former county commissioner from Williamson County who left office in 2022. He paused, and the pause carried weight. "The third beneficial owner of Ridgemont Capital Partners is Gerald Marsh." The silence in the space between Emily and Patricia was absolute. "The tax official," Emily said. Her voice came out flat and very quiet. "Gerald Marsh," Marcus confirmed, "who came to your garage in October to deliver your tax reassessment, owns a financial stake in the company that needs you to sell that property." Another pause. "He was not a county employee doing a routine review. He was an investor in the purchasing entity conducting reconnaissance on his own investment." Patricia said very softly, "That's criminal." "Conflict of interest at a minimum," Marcus said. "Fraud if the prosecution wants to argue the reassessment was issued in furtherance of the scheme, which given the timeline, the relationship between Gerald and Devin Marsh, and the documented pattern of the 10 prior cases, I believe they can." He paused. "Patricia, this morning I filed a formal complaint with the Texas State Ethics Commission regarding Gerald Marsh. I also sent a package of materials to the Travis County District Attorney's Office marked for the attention of the Chief of the Criminal Division, not the General Intake." "Why the Chief directly?" Emily asked. "Because the General Intake goes through County Administration," Marcus said. "And County Administration has at least 2 documented relationships with Voss through the Marsh family. The Chief of Criminal answers to the DAA directly and has her own intake process." A pause. "She called me back 40 minutes ago." Patricia sat up. "What did she say?" "She said she'd been looking at Voss Development for 8 months on an unrelated matter, and that the materials I sent this morning had just connected a set of dots she'd been trying to connect for the better part of a year." A pause. "She asked me to have Emily available for a formal interview on Friday." Emily stared at the phone. 8 months. The DA's criminal division had been building a case against Michael Voss for 8 months, and it had been sitting just below the surface, needing the one connection that could tie the pattern together. And Frank DeLuca's statement, in the school teacher's recording, and Marcus Webb's corporate ownership research had given it to them in a single morning. Patricia, Emily said slowly, did you know about this? I did not, Patricia said. She looked at the phone with the expression of a lawyer recalibrating. Marcus, how solid is this? Solid enough that the criminal division chief called back in 40 minutes, Marcus said. In my experience, that does not happen unless someone is very interested in what you've brought them. The call ended. Emily and Patricia sat across from each other. Emily, Patricia said. I know, Emily said. This is no longer just your case, Patricia said. If the criminal division takes this, Michael Voss is not looking at a civil dispute over a property transaction. He is looking at a coordinated fraud prosecution across multiple counties and potentially multiple states. Emily breathed slowly. Is this real, she said, not doubting it but needing to say it out loud. It's real, Patricia said. Outside, the sound of construction had begun in earnest, the particular percussion of work being done on a structure, tools, and voices, and the purposeful noise of things being built rather than burned. Emily stood up and walked to where she could see the property. The frame of the first wall was going up. Tomas's crew was moving fast and Cole was in it with them, and Bobby was at the edge directing two people she didn't recognize toward a section of the foundation, and the whole thing had the quality of a community barn raising from a different century transported into the present moment. All these people who didn't know each other 48 hours ago, working in proximity with the shared purpose of someone who needed help getting back to her feet. Jack came to stand next to her. The wall's going up, he said. I can see that, she said. He looked at her sideways. Something happened. With Patricia. It wasn't a question because Jack was the kind of man who read rooms accurately. The DA's criminal division has been building a case against Voss for 8 months, Emily said. Marcus connected the dots for them this morning. Jack was quiet. Gerald Marsh is a partial owner of Voss Development, Emily said. He came to my garage as a tax official while he was an investor in the company trying to buy my property. Jack looked at her. Jack, Emily said, what your people found, the 10 cases, the Marsh brothers, the corporate structure, that was the piece the DA's office was missing. Jack said nothing for a moment. He looked out at the work crew. Danny's good at finding things, he said finally. Always has been. Will you thank him for me? He's here, Jack said. You can thank him yourself. Emily looked across the property and found Danny lean and quiet, just like that first night standing near the back foundation with a tape measure helping two other people with a measurement. He looked up as people sometimes do when they know they're being watched and met her eyes across the distance. She raised a hand. He raised one back. Slight understated exactly as she would have expected from him. She turned back to Jack. What happens to Voss now, she said. He gets charged, Jack said, or he doesn't, and your civil case takes him apart piece by piece in court with Patricia at the wheel. He paused. Either way, Ms. Carter, the man who burned your building down, is not going to be burning anyone else's down anytime soon. Emily looked at the wall going up on her father's foundation. That's not enough, she said quietly. Jack looked at her. The other people, she said, the dry cleaner, the print shop, the school teacher in Waco, the 7 other cases, she turned to Jack. They lost things too. They lost them because they were alone, because there was nobody to make the call I made. Jack was quiet for a moment. What are you saying? He said. I'm saying, Emily said slowly, that when this is over, whatever it looks like when it's over, I want to do something about that, about the isolation, about people who are being pressured and have nobody to call. She paused. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I know it's something I want to figure out. Jack looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I think I know some people who might want to help with that. Before she could respond, Bobby's voice cut across the property. Miss Carter, you need to come see this. His tone was not alarmed, not urgent in the way of bad news. It was the tone of someone who had found something and needed her to see it immediately. She crossed the property to where Bobby was standing near the back corner of the foundation, the section that had been under the old office. He was holding something carefully the way you hold something fragile. It was a small metal box, Old scratch clearly from before the fire it had survived because it was metal buried in the debris of the collapsed floor. I found it under the old concrete when they were clearing for the drainage line, Bobby said. Oh. He handed it to her. Emily took it. She knew what it was before she opened it. She knew by the weight of it and the size of it and the particular dent on the upper left corner where Raymond Carter had dropped it off the workbench in 1994 and she had watched it fall. She opened it. Inside undamaged, perfectly intact in the plastic sleeve her father had put them in sometime in the late 1990s, the original property deed, the original survey map, the chain of title going back to 1986, the documents that had gone missing from her lockbox. Emily stood in the ash of her father's garage holding his original property documents in a metal box that had survived the fire. He had built this property to last a lifetime, and that had lasted, as it turned out, exactly that. She didn't say anything for a moment. Bobby was watching her. He buried it, Emily said finally. Her voice was not quite steady. Who? Bobby asked. My father, she said. He used to say that the most important things you keep where the fire can't reach them. She turned the box over in her hands. He said his grandfather taught him that, during the Depression. You put the important papers where the fire can't reach them and the flood can't touch them, and you know where they are when everything else is gone. Bobby was very still. He never told me where, Emily said, but he knew. He knew where they were. She held the box out across the property. The wall was going up, and the sounds of construction filled the afternoon air, and 200 people who had come from a night's ride away were working on the foundation her father had poured in 1986, and that had held. It had held through the fire. It was going to hold now. Emily Carter held her father's documents and stood in the wreckage he'd built and felt the full weight of what it meant that she had not sold, had not bent, had not let the closing circle close all the way, and these papers in her hands, this foundation under her feet, these people on her land, this was what had been waiting on the other side of that refusal. Bobby, she said. Yes, ma'am. Go tell Tomas we found the survey map, she said. Tell him the original property lines are confirmed and he can build to the full eastern boundary without any question. Bobby went. Emily tucked the metal box under her arm. She walked back to where Jack was standing. She held up the box. He looked at it. Original property documents, she said. My father buried them under the floor of the back office sometime in the 90s. She paused. They survived the fire. Jack looked at the box, then he looked at Emily. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. Something that reorganized the geography of his face entirely. He laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a restrained one, but a real one, full and sudden, and surprised the laugh of a man who had spent 30 years being unsurprised by things and had just been handed something he genuinely hadn't seen coming. Your father, he said when he recovered. My father, Emily confirmed. That man, Jack said, shaking his head, knew what he was doing. He always did, Emily said. I just didn't always know he knew. She looked at the wall going up straight and solid on the foundation that had held. Jack, she said, tell me honestly, is this going to work? He looked at her for a long moment. The laugh had passed, and what was left on his face was something she'd only seen there twice before on the night in the rain, when she'd waved them inside and at dawn on her porch when he'd said, you fixed 6 bikes for strangers. Emily, he said, it already is. The Friday interview with the DA's criminal division lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Emily sat across from a woman named Chief Investigator Dana Reyes, who had the posture of someone who had spent 2 decades sitting across from people who were lying and had developed a particular stillness. As a result, the stillness of someone who was listening not just to what you said, but to the architecture of how you said it, where you paused, where you didn't. Emily didn't pause where she shouldn't have. She had nothing to hide, and she knew the difference between that and having nothing to say. And she spent 4 hours and 20 minutes saying everything she had in order clearly the way her father had taught her to explain a repair. Start at the beginning, describe what you found, tell them what it meant. Dana Reyes took notes by hand. She did not look up often, but when she did, her eyes were precise and evaluating. And twice she stopped Emily mid-sentence to ask a question that went sideways into the story, in a direction Emily hadn't anticipated. And both times, Emily understood that Dana Reyes was not getting lost. She was checking the integrity of what she was hearing, the way you check a weld pressure at the points of stress to see if it holds. It held. At the end of the 4 hours and 20 minutes, Dana Reyes closed her notebook and looked at Emily directly for the first time in a sustained way. "Ms. Carter," she said, "I'm going to tell you something I don't typically tell witnesses at this stage." Emily waited. "The file Marcus Webb brought me on Tuesday," Dana Reyes said, "completed an evidentiary picture that my division has been building since last March. We had 9 of the 10 cases. We had the corporate structure. We had the pattern." She paused. "What we didn't have was a current active victim who had not sold, who had documentation of the process in real time, and who was willing to sit in this room for 4 hours and walk us through every piece of it." Emily said nothing. She understood she was being told something important, and she was going to let it land completely before she responded. "Michael Voss," Dana Reyes said, "is going to be indicted." The words sat in the air between them. Indicted, not investigated, not reviewed, not subject to an inquiry. Indicted. Emily breathed in slowly. "When?" she said. "That's not something I can share at this stage," Dana Reyes said. "But I want you to know that your interview today materially strengthened this case. The real-time documentation, the text, the phone records, the Bobby Nguyen customer list, the Howard Fitch written statement, those fill gaps we had been trying to fill for 8 months through inference." She paused. "You kept records, Ms. Carter." "My father taught me to keep records," Emily said. Dana Reyes looked at her for a moment. "He taught you well," she said. Emily drove back to Hatchfield in a state that was not quite calm and not quite excitement, but something in between, a kind of heightened, clear-eyed alertness, the feeling of a person standing at the top of something they have climbed for a long time, finally able to see the full distance they have traveled. She called Patricia from the truck. Patricia listened to the full account without interruption, and when Emily finished, there was a silence on the line that went on long enough that Emily said, "Patricia, are you there?" "I'm here," Patricia said. "I'm just Emily. Do you understand what you've done?" "I kept records," Emily said. "You kept records," Patricia said, and there was something in her voice that Emily recognized as the controlled version of something a great deal larger. "For 3 months, while this man was systematically destroying everything you built, you kept records. You documented every step. You preserved every piece of evidence. You did not let your anger make you careless, and you did not let your fear make you silent, and you did not let your grief make you stop." A pause. "Emily, I have been a lawyer for 20 years. I have worked with a lot of clients in a lot of bad situations. What you did, the discipline of it, the steadiness of it, I want you to know that it matters. What happens next matters. But what you did in those 3 months alone, that mattered first." Emily drove in silence for a moment. "Patricia," she said, "thank you for everything." "Thank me when it's over," Patricia said, but her voice was warm. The garage went up in 14 days, not 14 easy days. 14 days of early mornings and late evenings in the particular organized chaos of a construction project that had too many hands and too much goodwill, and occasionally needed Jack Reynolds to walk through a group of 12 people who were all trying to solve the same problem simultaneously and say, with the quiet authority of someone who had managed large groups of strong-willed people for 3 decades, "Tomas makes the call, everybody else builds." Tomas made the calls, everybody else built. Cole turned out to be exactly what he described: 8 years of framing experience translated into an ability to look at a structural problem and solve it faster than most people could articulate what the problem was. He and Bobby developed a working language within the first 2 days that was mostly hand signals and shorthand that Emily watched with a particular warmth, because Bobby was 22 and Cole was somewhere north of 40, and the gap between them collapsed entirely the moment there was work to be done that both of them cared about. Ruiz ran the kitchen operation out of the back of 2 trucks, feeding the work crews with the same efficiency he'd brought to Emily's cast iron skillet at 2 in the morning in the original garage. And what emerged over the 14 days was not just a building, but a community of people who had arrived as strangers and left as something else, connected by the particular bond that forms between people who have built something together with their hands. Mrs. Abernathy and her church group ran coffee and lunch logistics for the full 2 weeks without being asked to continue past the first day. Dale Whitmore's $800 went toward the electrical panel, and Dale himself spent 3 evenings helping the Houston electricians run conduit, because it turned out that Dale had done 2 years of electrical work in his 20s before his back had made that particular career path untenable, and he still knew enough to be useful. Howard Fitch showed up on day 4 with a written statement for Patricia, in a case of water bottles and a visible need to do something that counted. Emily put him to work managing the materials inventory, which required organization and follow-through, and which Howard turned out to be surprisingly good at, and which she suspected might also be doing something for whatever it was that had been sitting on his conscience since October. On the evening of day 7, Emily was doing a walkthrough of the new structure with Tomas when she stopped in the center of the main bay and stood still. Tomas kept walking for a few steps, then noticed she wasn't with him and turned back. "Everything okay?" he said. "It's bigger," Emily said. Tomas looked around. "About 30% larger than the original footprint," he said. "The foundation is the same, but the eastern wall with the confirmed boundary from your original survey, we had room to extend the bay 12 feet. He paused. "We used it." Emily looked at the space around her. The original Carter's garage had had 2 lifts in a bay that could accommodate 2 vehicles side by side with enough room to work barely. What she was standing in now could hold 4 vehicles comfortably, with a parts room that was twice the size of the original and a ceiling height that gave the new ventilation system room to do its job properly. "Tomas," she said, "who decided to extend the bay?" "Cole suggested it," Tomas said. "Once the survey confirmed the boundary, the math worked. We had the materials, actually had more than the original spec once 2 more supply contacts came through. Cole said," he paused, slightly uncomfortable, like a man reporting something that might be too personal to repeat accurately. "What did Cole say?" Emily said. Tomas looked at his boots for a second. "He said if you were going to have a garage, you should have a garage that was hard to mess with." Emily looked at the space again. Hard to mess with. She understood what that meant beyond the practical sense. A larger building at a confirmed boundary. A structure built by 200 people with established documentation. It was not just bigger, it was harder to intimidate, harder to pick off with a single manufactured violation. Harder to isolate and pressure because its existence was woven into the knowledge and memory of too many people to be quietly undone. "Thank Cole for me," she said. "Tell him yourself," Tomas said. "He's still here." The news about Michael Voss broke on a Thursday morning, which was also day 12 of the rebuild. Emily heard it first from Bobby, who had seen it on his phone while getting coffee from Ruiz's truck, and who came across the property to find her with the look of someone carrying news he wasn't quite sure how to hold. "Ms. Carter," he said. She looked at his face. "What happened?" He handed her his phone. The headline was from the Austin American-Statesman. It was not a small headline. Voss Development CEO indicted on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and arson conspiracy across 3 counties. Emily read the first 3 paragraphs standing in the middle of her half-built garage. The indictment covered 11 properties across Travis Williamson and McLennan counties, spanning 7 years. Gerald Marsh and Devin Marsh were named as co-conspirators. 2 county employees in the building inspection office had been charged separately. The man who had set the fire at Carter's garage, identified by security footage from a neighboring property that the arson investigation had recovered, had been arrested 2 days ago and had, according to the article, provided a full statement in exchange for a reduced charge. Emily lowered the phone. She handed it back to Bobby. She stood in the half-built garage for a moment without speaking. Bobby waited. "Bobby, she said finally. "Yes, ma'am. Go find Jack for me." Jack was at the back of the Berfstedt property talking to one of the electrical crew. He came when Bobby found him walking across the construction zone with the unhurried stride of a man who had learned that urgency and pace were different things. He read her face when he reached her and said nothing, just raised an eyebrow. Emily said, "He's been indicted this morning. 11 properties, multiple charges. The Marsh brothers are named as co-conspirators." Jack's face was very still. "And the man who set the fire," he said. "Arrested 2 days ago," Emily said. "He gave a statement." Jack looked at her. Then he said very quietly, "It's done." "It's done," Emily confirmed. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked across the property at the crew working on the new wall, at Cole and Bobby in the far corner, at Ruiz's truck, and the cluster of people around it at the partially completed structure that was already more solid and more permanent than the building that had stood here before. "Your father would be angry about the fire," Jack said. Emily looked at him. "And then he'd be proud of the building," Jack said. "And then he'd be back at work before either feeling had a chance to stay too long." He glanced at her sideways. "Am I close?" Emily felt something move through her that had been looking for a way out for a long time. Dead on, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, and she didn't apologize for it. The story spread faster than Emily had anticipated and in directions she hadn't expected. The Statesman article mentioned Carter's garage by name, and it mentioned the 200 Hells Angels who had shown up to rebuild it, and that detail, that specific, particular, improbable detail, was the thing that caught fire in the way that certain stories do when they contain something that cuts against the expected shape of the world. By Friday morning, the story had been picked up by 3 Texas TV stations in a national wire service. By Friday afternoon, Emily's phone had received 47 calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She let most of them go to voicemail and had Bobby screen them because she had a garage to finish and a life to get back to, and she was not going to let the noise of external attention disrupt the actual work at hand. But Bobby flagged 3 of them as something different from the others, and she returned those. The first was from a woman in Waco named Margaret Tilson, who introduced herself as the retired school teacher whose recording had helped Patricia build the case. She said she'd seen Emily's name in the article and had wanted to call to say thank you, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down. "I should have done something sooner," Margaret said. "You did something when it mattered," Emily said. "That's what counts." "They took my print shop," Margaret said. 22 years. "I know," Emily said. "I'm sorry." "I'm not calling for sorry," Margaret said, and her voice had something in it that reminded Emily of herself, a particular directness that came from a woman who had been through something and had not been diminished by it. "I'm calling because I heard what you said in the article about wanting to do something for people who are isolated, people who are being pressured and don't have anyone to call." Emily went still. "You heard that," she said. "The reporter quoted you," Margaret said. "Emily, I have been thinking about that for 2 days, because that is the thing I needed 14 months ago. Someone to call, someone who knew how to help." A pause. "I have time. My husband passed last year and my kids are grown, and I have time, and I have a story that apparently matters to prosecutors, and I have Emily. I want to help with whatever you're thinking about." Emily sat down. She had said the thing to Jack in a moment of feeling standing in the ruins and knowing that the fight was not entirely about her, that it was about the shape of a system that preyed on aloneness. She had not known what she meant by it in practical terms. She had just known it was true. But Margaret Tilson, calling from Waco, who had lost 22 years to Michael Voss and had sat with a recording for 14 months because she'd had no one to tell it to, Margaret Tilson was the practical terms. "Margaret," Emily said, "can I call you back in a week when the building is done and things are a little less loud?" "I'll be here," Margaret said. The second call was from a journalist named Kira Sanchez, who was not calling about the story that had already been published, but about a longer piece she was writing for a regional magazine about predatory land acquisition practices in Texas and what happened to small property owners who tried to fight back. She was direct and clearly had done her homework, and she asked good questions, which Emily respected. Emily talked to her for 20 minutes and said she'd do a fuller interview once the garage was open. "One question now," Kira said, "if you can." "Go ahead." "What made you not sell?" Kira said. "Most people in your situation sell. What was the thing that made you hold?" Emily thought about it, about Raymond Carter's 30 years, about the pegboard and the hand-lettered sign in the photograph of a 9-year-old holding a wrench, about a lockbox buried under a concrete floor with documents inside it protected against fires that hadn't happened yet. "My father built something real," she said finally, "and I wasn't going to be the one who let someone take it because they decided they wanted it more than he'd work for it." She paused. "My father worked for 30 years. Michael Voss sent a man to burn it down in one night. Those two things are not equivalent, and I refuse to let them be treated as if they were." Kira was quiet for a moment. "That's going in the piece," she said. "That's fine," Emily said. The third call was from a man named James Okafor, who Emily first assumed was related to Patricia, before he explained that he was a regional director for a small business advocacy organization based in San Antonio. He had read the article and had a specific question: would Emily be willing to speak at a conference they were hosting in 3 months on the subject of predatory acquisition practices and what small business owners could do to protect themselves? Emily said she would think about it. After the 3 calls, she went and found Jack. He was in conversation with Cole and Danny near the front of the property, the three of them examining something on a clipboard. She waited until there was a pause. "Jack," she said, "the thing I said about wanting to do something about people who are isolated, people who need someone to call." "I remember," he said. "I've had 3 calls this morning from people who want to be part of it," she said. "A retired teacher from Waco, a journalist, a small business advocacy director in San Antonio." She paused. "It's not just a feeling anymore. People want to build it." Jack looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Danny. Danny looked at Emily. "I told you," he said, in the quiet, direct way Danny said most things. "The old man from Laredo, the one who helped you with your radiator. He'd be glad to know." Emily looked at him. "He'd be glad to know," Danny said again, "that the person he helped grew up to be the kind of person who builds something like this." Emily stood there with that for a moment. Then she said, "All right, let's go finish the building." The day Carter's garage reopened was the 22nd day after the fire. Not 30 days as Cole had estimated. 22. Because the crew had pushed in the final week with the particular intensity that people bring to the end of a thing they have built together and don't want to let go of. And because Tomas had a gift for finding the path between what was possible and what was planned, and because Bobby Nguyen had not slept more than 5 hours a night for the last 10 days and showed no signs of noticing. Emily arrived at 6:15 in the morning, an hour and 15 minutes before anyone else was due. She had a reason for coming early that she hadn't explained to anyone. She went inside and stood in the center of the new main bay. It was the right size and the wrong smell. A new building smells like materials, lumber and paint, and fresh concrete, not like the accumulated decades of a working garage, the particular layering of oil and rubber and metal and coffee, and the specific human record of 38 years of work that had saturated the walls and floor of the original building. That smell was gone with a fire. This smell was clean and new and correct in every way, except the way that mattered most to Emily in this specific moment. She stood in it anyway. She thought about her father. She thought about him the way she'd been thinking about him since the fire, not with the raw grief of the early years after his death, not with the soft, bittersweet warmth that had become the usual mode of remembering him. She thought about him the way she thought about the buried lockbox, as a man who had known something she was only now fully understanding. He had buried those documents under the floor not because he expected a fire in particular. He had done it because he understood that the things worth building were worth protecting against the worst possibilities, and that the people worth being were the ones who prepared for adversity without being defined by the fear of it. He had built a garage. He had helped people who couldn't pay. He had kept records and buried the important papers and taught his daughter the difference between math that matters and math that doesn't. And then he'd left her this building, and she had kept it going by being exactly what he taught her to be, and someone had tried to take it, and the reason they had failed, the full, complete reason, was that Raymond Carter had spent 30 years being the kind of person who made the kind of daughter who opened a garage door to strangers in the rain. That was the chain. That was how it worked. Emily put her hand flat on the wall of the new building. "We're still here, Dad," she said quietly. Then she heard a car pull up outside, and then another, and then the particular sound of Dale Whitmore's truck, which still had a slight hitch in the transmission. She kept telling him she'd fix, and then the low murmur of voices, and then Bobby's voice somewhere in it, and she took her hand off the wall and walked to the bay door and raised it. The morning light came in, and behind it, her town. Mrs. Abernathy brought a pie. That was the first thing Emily saw clearly. When the door went up, the older woman standing in the front of the small crowd that had gathered holding a pie with the particular careful two-handed grip of someone who had carried it a long distance and was determined not to drop it now. Behind her were maybe 40 people from Hatchfield customers, old and returned neighbors. The owner of the hardware store where Emily had bought her parts, 2 women from the diner, who had closed early to be here, the afternoon staff from the gas station on Route 9, who had watched the fire trucks go past 2 weeks ago and had not forgotten. And behind them in the road, 6 Harleys, just 6 this time. Jack, Cole, Danny, Ruiz, Marcus, and one other she didn't immediately recognize, a woman she hadn't met in the original group who turned out to be named Sadie and who had the manner of someone who went where Jack went without needing to explain why. They hadn't brought the full 200 back for the opening. Emily understood why without asking. The opening was hers. The opening was Hatchfield's. The rebuild had been their gift, and the gift was already given, and they were here now simply as the six people who had started the whole chain of it on a rainy night that none of them had planned. Emily looked at Jack. Jack looked at Emily. The sign, he said, and nodded at the wall beside the bay door. Emily turned. Bobby had put it up while she was inside. She hadn't asked him to, hadn't known he was going to. And the fact that he had done it without being asked told her everything she needed to know about who Bobby Nguyen was going to be when he was done growing into himself. It was a wooden sign, hand-lettered. She recognized the hand because she'd seen it in the receipt books, in the column headers of the ledgers, in 38 years of the careful, particular penmanship of Raymond Carter. Bobby had copied it from a piece of paper she hadn't known he'd found a note her father had written on the back of an invoice sometime in the 1990s, a note she'd kept in the desk without quite reading it again, and which Bobby had apparently read and understood in the way that young people sometimes understand things that were meant for them without knowing they were meant for them. The sign said a door opened in the rain. A family was built at dawn. Emily stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she turned back to the crowd. Dale Whitmore was watching her with the direct, unperformed emotion of a man who had known Raymond Carter for years and was feeling the full weight of what he was looking at. Mrs. Abernathy had tears on her face and was not bothering to pretend otherwise. Bobby was standing to the side with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who was hoping very hard that they have done the right thing. Emily looked at him. "Bobby," she said. He looked at her. "Come here," she said. He came. She put her hand on his shoulder. "When you graduate," she said, "and you're ready, there's a job here, a real one, full-time, with your name on the schedule." Bobby's face did something complicated and young and genuine. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "Good," Emily said. Then she looked out at the people gathered in front of the new Carter's garage on a Thursday morning in Hatchville, Texas, and she felt the full shape of what had happened, not just the garage, not just the indictment, not just the sign on the wall. The full shape of what a single decision made in a rainstorm could grow into when the person making it was the right person in the right moment, willing to open the door. She raised her voice enough for everyone to hear. "We're open," she said. The last conversation happened 40 minutes later when most of the crowd had moved inside and the coffee was going, and Dale was showing Marcus something under the hood of his truck with the evangelistic energy of a man who had been waiting for an audience, and Mrs. Abernathy's pie had been cut and distributed and universally approved of. Jack found Emily standing near the road. He stood next to her. They watched the morning for a moment. "Danny said something to me last night," Jack said. "He said you were the one who fixed things. That's who you are. It's not just the job, it's the way you look at something broken and figure out what it needs." Emily considered that. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I'm just my father's daughter." "Not just," Jack said. She looked at him. "Your father built a garage," Jack said. "You built something bigger than that." He paused. "I'm not sure yet what to call it, but it's bigger." Emily thought about Margaret Tilson in Waco, about Frank DeLuca, who had finally said the thing he should have said 14 months ago, about James Okafor's conference in San Antonio, and Kira Sanchez's magazine piece, and Dana Reyes's closed notebook, and the indictment that had turned 11 silent cases into a public record that could not be unread. She thought about the sign on the wall and her father's handwriting reborn in Bobby's hand. She thought about what Danny had said. The old man from Laredo would be glad to know. "Jack," she said, "are you going to stay in touch?" He looked at her sideways. "You're in my phone," he said. "That doesn't happen." "Good," she said. He put out his hand. She shook it. Then he went to his bike. One by one, the 6 Harleys started. The sound filled the morning the way it had filled the morning 3 weeks ago, but differently now, not arriving, departing, which had its own particular note lower and more resolved, the sound of something completed. Emily watched them pull out of Hatchfield onto Route 9, heading south the same direction they'd come from on a rainy night that had started all of this. She watched until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she went inside her father's garage and got back to work. Because that was what she did. It was the only thing she'd ever truly known how to do. And now she knew something else about it, knew it all the way through in the place where knowing becomes bone rather than thought. The work you do with honest hands doesn't disappear when someone tries to burn it down. It goes into the ground and it waits, and it comes back bigger than it was. And the kindness you give away in the dark finds its way home. It always finds its way home.